Before we begin, if you enjoy long-form true crime compilations, please subscribe and leave a like. It really helps support the channel. Somewhere in the far northeast of Russia, beyond long stretches of frozen road and empty forest, there is a town that no longer belongs to time. In winter, snow piles up against the sides of apartment buildings. Wind moves through broken windows, carrying dust, old paper, and silence from room to room. The streets are still there. The schools are still standing. Even the street signs remain. But almost no one lives here anymore. There was a time when this place was full of routine and noise. Lights glowed in apartment windows late into the night. Workers returned home after long shifts, their boots leaving tracks in the snow that were erased by morning. Children memorized the same streets, walked the same paths, lived the same days, over and over again. This town was not meant to be temporary. It was built to last. It was built because it served a purpose. And for a while, that purpose held everything together. Kadikin was never meant to be beautiful. It was never meant to be easy. It existed in one of the coldest, most remote regions on Earth, where winter lasts most of the year and isolation is a fact of life. People did not come here by accident. They came because they were needed, and they stayed because leaving was not simple. For years, life followed a predictable rhythm. Work, rest, winter, repetition. The town learned how to survive in silence and cold. It learned how to endure. Then, slowly at first, something changed. Not overnight, not all at once. A shift in routine, a growing uncertainty, a sense that the future was no longer guaranteed. Families began to leave. Apartments emptied. Schools grew quieter. The town that once depended on constant activity began to slow down, as if it were running out of breath. Eventually, the silence took over. Today, Kadikin feels like a place paused mid-sentence. Furniture still sits where it was left. Calendars still hang on walls, frozen on forgotten dates. Toys remain scattered across apartment floors, untouched for decades. It is not a town destroyed by war, not erased by fire or flood. It is a town that was simply abandoned. And what makes Kadikin unsettling is not just that people left. It's how quietly it happened, how quickly a living place became a forgotten one. This is the story of why Kadikin was built, what went wrong, and how an entire town slowly disappeared into the cold. Kadikin did not appear by accident. It was born from necessity, from a demand buried deep beneath the frozen ground. Coal. Coal was more than a resource in the Soviet Union. It powered cities, warmed homes, fueled industry, and kept remote regions alive through the bitter winters where temperatures could drop so low that even breathing felt sharp. Without coal, life in these far reaches would be impossible. When a seam of coal was discovered near this remote stretch of Siberia, the decision was immediate. A town would be built. And not just a few buildings. A town meant to support thousands, designed entirely around the mine that would sustain it. The location was harsh. Endless forests stretched as far as the eye could see, rivers froze solid in winter, and roads were little more than snow-packed trails that disappeared under blizzards. For anyone accustomed to the comforts of larger cities, it was a place few would willingly choose. But the Soviet system did not see hardship the way outsiders did. Distance was irrelevant. Difficulty was a challenge to be overcome, and survival in the North required organization, planning, and, above all, manpower. Workers were sent in groups. Some came willingly, drawn by the promise of steady employment, housing, and the stability of a planned life. Others were relocated with less choice, part of a system that expected compliance and contribution. Families followed, bringing children who would grow up knowing only the rhythm of the mine. Apartments were built close together, compact and functional, designed to retain heat against the long Siberian winter. Schools followed, along with small shops, clinics, and community centers. Every building had a purpose. Every road, every streetlight, every lamppost was placed with the town's survival in mind. Life in Kadikin revolved around the mine. Shifts dictated the daily schedule. Supplies arrived on the condition that work continued. The town's electricity and heating depended on the coal extracted from the ground. For those who lived here, the mine was more than a workplace. It was the heartbeat of the town. In the early years, there was optimism. Miners told stories of rich coal veins. Children learned their first lessons in classrooms built just for them, and families adapted to life in the frozen wilderness. The winter was harsh, but predictable. Snowfall, blizzards, and freezing winds were part of a cycle, a rhythm that shaped the town as much as the mine did. Everyday life was structured. Workers woke before dawn, the sound of boots and shovels filling the air. Meals were eaten in common dining areas or within apartment kitchens, modest but warm. Children played in snow-packed streets. Their laughter carried over frozen courtyards. Even leisure was practical. Community events, school performances, small theater nights. Activities designed to keep morale steady and maintain the rhythm of the town. And yet, for all its structure, Kedikon was not comfortable. Comfort was secondary to survival. Heat was precious. Electricity could fail. Food supplies were strictly rationed. Isolation weighed on everyone, shaping both mood and behavior. People learned to adapt, to measure days not by enjoyment, but by endurance. But adaptation can only sustain so long. The town was created for a single purpose, and every brick, every beam, every corner depended on that purpose. If the mine faltered, if the rhythm broke, the town's very foundation would tremble. And eventually it did. Each morning in Kedikon began quietly, though never entirely silently. Snow crunched under boots before dawn, and the wind whispered along empty streets, pressing against buildings and rattling loose shutters. Apartment lights flickered on, one by one, as families stirred to life. Curtains were drawn aside to glimpse a gray, frozen sky. Inside, radiators hummed in their quiet battle against the Siberian cold. Children woke wrapped in layers of clothing, woolen sweaters, thick scarves, mittens, hats pulled low over ears. They brushed the frost from windows and doors, leaving small handprints that would freeze before anyone noticed. Boots laced, scarves tied, they stepped into the streets that had already been brushed by the footsteps of others making their way to work. The air bit sharply at their cheeks, and their breaths hung in the cold like smoke before disappearing into nothing. Miners followed the same rhythm. They left their apartments with lunch pails and tools, boots clattering against icy steps. The town was quiet, but it moved with purpose. Each person had a path, a role, a duty. The mine dictated the tempo. If it paused, the town paused. If it worked, life in Kedikon flowed like a clock, mechanical but reliable. Inside apartments, life was modest but functional. Furniture was simple, wooden chairs and tables, small stoves and kitchens, beds covered in thick blankets. Families ate quickly but carefully. Food was rationed, so every meal was measured with attention. A mother stirred porridge while her children listened to the radio for news, their attention divided between the familiar voices and the faint crackle that carried through the cold walls. Conversations were quiet but constant, reminders to dress warmly, instructions for chores, shared news about neighbors or the weather. Evening routines mirrored mornings. Footsteps echoed through hallways, doors opened and closed with soft thuds, and families gathered in kitchens to eat, talk, or simply sit in warmth while the wind outside pressed against walls and windows. Sometimes a neighbor knocked, bringing news or simple companionship, a shared human presence in a town where the outside world was mostly unreachable. Life in Kedikon revolved around patterns. Shifts in the mine began and ended with clockwork precision. Day shifts overlapped with night shifts in a seamless flow, ensuring the mine never truly stopped. Men and women moved between work, home, and communal spaces with careful timing. Their days divided into blocks of labor, meals, rest, and repetition. Safety checks were routine, conversations were structured, and unspoken rules dictated how people interacted in the extreme isolation. The children grew up immersed in this rhythm. Schools operated with strict schedules, lessons in mathematics, reading, and history. Teachers knew each child's habits, their strengths, their weaknesses. The classroom was small, warm, and alive with quiet energy. During breaks, children played on snow-covered courtyards, their laughter muffled by thick coats and scarves. The sound of wind over frozen rooftops occasionally carried a ghostly echo, but the children were undeterred. Outside, winter dominated every experience. Snowbanks grew taller than children's heads, and drifts could swallow small streets overnight. The cold was relentless, and yet people adapted. Walkways were shoveled, fires stoked, supplies carefully measured. The town's structure itself offered protection. Buildings were clustered to conserve heat, streets were planned to minimize exposure to wind, and communal spaces offered warmth and connection. Despite the harshness, there were moments of quiet joy. A teacher might organize a small play in the school auditorium. Neighbors would gather briefly to share bread or tea. Children built forts in the snow, their imagination turning frozen streets into castles or battlegrounds. These small rituals created normalcy in a world defined by survival. But even amid routine, life carried tension. Mining was dangerous. Accidents were often minor, but each one reminded families of the precariousness beneath their feet. Tools failed. Machinery broke. Roads became impassable in blizzards. The isolation amplified each difficulty. Help was rarely close. The nearest major town was hundreds of kilometers away. Over time, cracks in the town's rhythm began to appear. Supply shipments arrived late. Minor repairs went undone. Equipment failures that could once be ignored now lingered. Conversations carried whispers of worry. A child might hear their parents discuss uncertainties about the mine's stability or the possibility of reduced shifts. Adults began to notice small changes in the routines that had once offered comfort. And yet, most residents pressed on. Life, no matter how fragile, demanded continuity. Work continued. Schools continued. Meals were prepared. Children still walked familiar paths. Snow was shoveled. Fires were lit. Day followed day. Week followed week. Winter after winter, with the quiet determination of a town built to endure. The rhythm of Kadikkin, however, was tied entirely to the mine. Each shift, each ton of coal, each delivery maintained the delicate balance that kept life in motion. The town had no independence from its purpose, no alternative to sustain it if the mine faltered. It was a living system, but one completely dependent on a single source. Even the smallest disruption created tension. A delay in supplies, a broken boiler, a minor accident underground. Each one rippled through the community. Families noticed changes in the routines. Children saw their playgrounds become quieter. Shops closed early due to fewer customers. Community centers hosted fewer events. The snow outside seemed louder, emptier, the wind sharper. Despite these warnings, life carried on. Adaptation was the norm. Survival required endurance, repetition, and silence. Residents learned to expect instability, even as they hoped for consistency. And beneath it all, the first seeds of uncertainty were planted. The rhythm of Kadikkin, once steady and predictable, was beginning to falter. Life in Kadikkin had always revolved around the mine. From the early morning shift to the last descending elevator at night, the town's rhythm was dictated by the underground world below. The coal shaft stretched deep into the frozen earth, a maze of tunnels illuminated by dim electric lamps and the occasional flickering of older bulbs. The walls were damp, cold dust hung in the air, and the cold seeped even through layers of clothing. Miners moved in a careful dance, familiar with each step and hazard. Each shift had its routine. Check machinery, inspect support beams, test air quality, and then begin the labor of extracting the black veins that sustain the town. Tools clinked against rock. Belts hummed. Small explosions of coal occasionally broke the silence. The work was dangerous but controlled, or at least it was meant to be. Over time, subtle changes began to appear. Minor accidents became more frequent. A slipped pickaxe, a small collapse in a side tunnel, a faint gas warning that technicians dismissed as false alarms. Word traveled slowly through the town. At first, these events were shrugged off. It happens, people said. The mine has always been difficult. But small stories began to circulate in hushed tones. I heard Sergei's brother nearly got trapped last week. They said the support beams in Shaft 3 are weak. Families noticed the tension too. Children saw miners returning home with smudged faces, faces that were paler than usual, hands shaking from exhaustion or cold. Conversations grew cautious. Adults whispered, but the town carried on, holding on to routine as a shield against worry. Meals were eaten with quiet glances. Schools continued. Shops opened and closed as usual. But the rhythm of life felt subtly off. Then, one winter, the mine itself reminded everyone how fragile their existence truly was. It began as a faint vibration felt by those working in the deepest tunnels. An unusual smell of gas lingered in the air. Tools rattled against walls without reason. The supervisors took note, but progress was expected, and delays were seen as unacceptable. And then, in a single, sudden moment, the world beneath Kadikin exploded. The shock wave traveled through the tunnels with terrifying speed. Cold dust rose into the air, and smoke pushed toward the surface. Workers tried to escape, some successfully, others trapped by falling beams or collapsing ceilings. The noise, metal, rock, and human voices was overwhelming, a cacophony that would echo in the memories of those who survived. Above ground, the town reacted almost immediately. Sirens wailed. Families ran outside, searching for familiar faces. Mothers called for children. Fathers and husbands raced toward the mine, hoping for any sign of their colleagues. By the end of the day, it was clear that lives had been lost. The community felt the weight of vulnerability in a new, undeniable way. The mine was temporarily closed for inspection. Engineers, bureaucrats, and officials arrived, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. Information was scarce. Residents were told that safety had been compromised, repairs were underway, and work would resume as soon as possible. But as soon as possible stretched into days, then weeks. Equipment remained broken. Shifts were reduced. Paychecks arrived inconsistently. Supplies were delayed. The town's routines began to falter. Where once the rhythm of work dictated the day, now uncertainty lingered. Miners walked more cautiously. Families hesitated before leaving apartments. Children noticed the absence of fathers or older siblings at the dinner table. Schools felt emptier. Streets were quieter. Whispers of worry became conversation. Is it safe? People asked quietly in the markets or apartment hallways. Some considered leaving immediately, but relocation was complicated. Housing elsewhere was uncertain. Jobs outside the town were rare. Those who had spent their entire lives in Kadikin had no easy path to leave. The psychological impact was as tangible as the physical. Anxiety seeped into routines. Even the smallest disruptions, a delayed meal, a missing delivery, a malfunctioning heater, felt monumental. The town, once a precise machine of survival, began to feel fragile. It existed, but its stability was no longer guaranteed. Yet outwardly, life continued. Meals were prepared. Children went to school. Shops opened. The rhythm persisted, but beneath it, fear grew, subtle and persistent. People began to notice small signs of change. An apartment left empty, a hallway darker than usual, footsteps fewer on the streets. Every winter storm, every blackout, every creaking of the old buildings reminded them that the town's security was conditional, not absolute. By the time the mine reopened, everyone understood that Kadikin had changed forever. The explosion had not destroyed the town, but it had broken something far more crucial: the belief in permanence, the foundation of daily life. The certainty that work, food, heating, and community would continue had shifted into uncertainty. And once that belief faltered, every other aspect of life followed. Shifts were cut, supplies slowed, and families began to wonder quietly, how much longer can we stay? Life went on, but the shadows had lengthened. Life in Kadikin had always revolved around the mine. From the first flicker of light at dawn to the last descending elevator at night, the town's heartbeat was tied to the tunnels beneath the frozen ground. The mine ran deep into the Siberian earth, a labyrinth of coal seams, timbered supports, and narrow passageways. The walls were cold and damp, streaked with coal dust, and the air always carried a faint metallic smell. Even the warmest coats could not completely shield miners from the chill that seeped through the tunnels. Each day began with preparation. Miners checked their equipment, inspected helmets, lanterns, and respirators. They listened for the faint hum of machinery and the subtle vibrations in the earth, signs of activity or potential danger. Every shift had its rhythm. Descend the shaft, follow the map corridors, extract coal, transport it to the surface, repeat. It was repetitive, exhausting, and dangerous work, but it was the rhythm of life in Kadikkin, and those who worked here had adapted. Families at home followed their own rhythms, synchronized with the mine's operations. Children woke to the sound of muffled boots on stairs, the scraping of metal doors, and the faint hiss of heating radiators. They dressed in layers of wool and fur, mittens and scarves pulled tight over their faces, and stepped into the cold morning air, leaving behind handprints on frost-covered windows. Mothers stirred pots of porridge or tea, careful not to waste any food. Fathers kissed their children goodbye, huddled in heavy coats, and made their way toward the mine. The town itself seemed to wake gradually, each apartment, shop, and school contributing to a slow crescendo of activity. Inside the apartments, life was practical. Furniture was simple: wooden chairs, small tables, cots lined with thick blankets. Kitchens smelled of boiling water, fried bread, and the occasional lingering scent of coal smoke. Families gathered for meals, talking quietly about schedules, weather, or news from other towns. The children listened, absorbing routines and responsibilities, learning the unspoken rules of survival in a remote settlement where life depended on the mine. Miners shared camaraderie and unspoken trust. They knew every tunnel, every creaking support, every dangerous patch of coal seam. The work was physically demanding, but they drew strength from routine, from the familiarity of the tasks and the presence of colleagues. A dropped tool, a slight tremor in the ground, or an unusual smell of gas could be enough to halt work temporarily. But these warnings were often ignored under pressure to maintain output. Life, after all, depended on it. Yet subtle changes began to creep in. Minor accidents increased. A coal cart derailed, a support beam splintered, a lantern flickered in the distance. At first, these incidents were shrugged off with familiar phrases. It happens, the mine has always been tricky. But whispers spread among workers and families. Sergei's brother nearly trapped last week. The supports in Shaft 3 might not hold. Small anxieties began to settle into conversations, quiet and almost invisible against the backdrop of daily life. Winter made everything harsher. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Snow drifted through the streets, piling high against apartment buildings, blocking paths and muting sound. Even indoors, the cold could bite, seeping through walls and floors, reminding residents of the isolation that defined Kadikkin. Children learned to navigate icy streets with caution, while adults checked heating systems, cleared snow from entrances, and ensured that food supplies were intact. Life required constant vigilance. Then, one winter, the latent danger became undeniable. A faint tremor ran through the tunnels one evening, barely noticeable, but enough to catch the attention of supervisors. A strange smell of gas lingered in the deepest shafts. Equipment rattled inexplicably. The warning signs were subtle, but they were there. Miners exchanged cautious glances. Families noticed slight hesitations in routines, the quiet anxiety behind otherwise mundane conversations. And then, without warning, it happened. A sudden explosion tore through the coal seemed deep underground. Shockwaves rattled beams and walls. Dust filled the air, and smoke pushed toward the surface. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of rock, metal, and panicked shouts. Miners scrambled, some escaping through narrow tunnels, others trapped by collapsing ceilings. Every second stretched endlessly as those inside the mine fought to survive. Above ground, The town reacted immediately. Sirens screamed, echoing off snow-packed streets and apartment walls. Families ran from their homes, searching desperately for loved ones. Mothers called children by name. Fathers and husbands raced toward the mine, hoping for any sign of colleagues. By the end of the day, the truth was inescapable. Lives had been lost. The explosion was not only a physical rupture, it fractured the town's sense of safety and control. The mine was temporarily shut down. Engineers, officials, and bureaucrats arrived, their presence both comforting and unsettling. The news was sparse. Safety was compromised. Repairs were underway. Work would resume when possible. Days turned into weeks. Equipment remained damaged. Shifts were reduced. Paychecks arrived late or irregularly. Supplies were inconsistent. The once predictable rhythm of life slowed. The town's routines faltered. Streets were quieter. Schools seemed emptier. Shops opened late, closed early, or remained shuttered. Miners returned home exhausted, wary of the next shift. Families worried silently. Children sensed tension in the air, noticing empty seats at tables and silent corridors in the school. The town, once a precise machine of survival, had begun to feel fragile. Conversations grew cautious. Is it safe? People whispered. Will work resume? Adults debated quietly about leaving, but relocation was complicated. Housing elsewhere was scarce, jobs uncertain. Generations who had spent their lives in Kadikkin had no simple alternatives. The town's isolation, once a manageable fact of life, had become a weight pressing against everyone's chest. Small cracks multiplied. Minor equipment failures delayed shifts. Deliveries were inconsistent. Heating systems faltered during long, brutal nights. Residents adapted as best they could, but each disruption compounded the growing sense of unease. Even the simplest activities, clearing snow, walking to school, cooking meals, carried the weight of uncertainty. Fear settled into daily life like a cold mist. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance at the mine entrance, hesitation before stepping into a drifting snowstorm, whispered warnings among neighbors. Over time, the fear became tangible, shaping routines and altering interactions. Children noticed the absence of friends and neighbors. Schools hosted fewer students. Streets, once alive with laughter and boots crunching on snow, became hushed. Yet life continued. Meals were prepared. Children went to school. Shops and community centers remained open, even if fewer people attended. The rhythm of Kadikkin persisted, but beneath it, anxiety grew. Each storm, blackout, or minor malfunction became a reminder that the town's stability was conditional. Families began to consider leaving quietly. One apartment emptied, then another. Small groups relocated when possible, carrying what they could, leaving behind furniture, dishes, and personal belongings. The departures were subtle, almost invisible at first, but gradually the town felt the weight of absence. By the time the mine resumed partial operations, it was clear Kadikkin had changed. The explosion had not destroyed buildings, but it had shattered certainty. The foundation of daily life, work, heat, food, and community was no longer guaranteed. The town, once secure, had become fragile, and once the residents realized this, the slow drift toward abandonment began. As the weeks turned into months after the mine incident, Kadikkin's streets began to change. The rhythm that had once defined the town, shifts, school bells, children's laughter, the hum of heating systems, slowed to an almost imperceptible crawl. Apartment blocks that had been home to bustling families now sat quiet, the windows reflecting a frozen landscape, empty yet perfectly intact. Snow accumulated against doors and walls, untouched by shovels or footsteps. Wind crept through gaps in roofs and broken windows, carrying the scent of cold, dust, and coal. Some families left quickly, taking what they could carry and locking their doors behind them. Others lingered, waiting for assurances that would never come. Paychecks that were late, equipment repairs that remained incomplete, rumors of reopening that dissolved under the weight of reality. The decision to leave was never easy. Generations had lived here, Children had never known another home. Leaving meant stepping into uncertainty, trading routine for the unknown. Yet necessity slowly pushed them out. Inside the apartments of those who stayed, life became a fragile balance. Heating stuttered in some buildings. Radiators failed during the coldest nights. Families layered blankets over blankets, cooked meals with ration supplies, and carried on as if nothing had changed. Children noticed the quiet first. They wandered the halls, calling for friends who no longer lived there, peering through snow-covered windows for familiar faces that never appeared. Toys remained where they had been left, half forgotten, frozen in place by time and winter. The streets themselves became repositories of memory. Footprints faded, replaced only by windswept snow. Wooden benches splintered under frost. Lampposts leaned at awkward angles, their bulbs flickering or dead. Shops were shuttered, doors left ajar. The smell of coal lingered, clinging stubbornly to the town as if refusing to leave. Mailboxes hung empty, and community centers, once alive with small gatherings, were silent. Each day, the town shrank in both function and spirit, though the buildings remained structurally sound. Those who remained experienced a different kind of isolation. Their neighbors left one by one, until a familiar face was a rarity. Streets once busy with work boots and children's laughter became ghostly pathways, echoing with the occasional crunch of snow under a single passerby's feet. Inside homes, the absence of neighbors was palpable. Doorways led to empty rooms, apartments echoed with silence and small details. A forgotten jacket, a half-read book, served as reminders of lives that had moved on. The psychological toll was subtle but profound. People adapted, but anxiety lingered like a shadow. Miners who stayed were cautious in their work, aware that the mine had changed them and the town forever. Parents worried constantly for their children, balancing the need for routine against the uncertainty of what each day might bring. Even the simplest act, stepping outside into the biting cold, carried the weight of risk. Roads were impassable at times, snow piled high against apartment doors and stairways, and wind howled through the empty streets, bending signs and rattling shutters. In the schools, classrooms stood frozen in time. Desks remained where students had left them. Blackboards bore half-erased lessons, and notebooks lay open on the floor. The children who had remained watched as their friends vanished from the town, leaving behind echoes of laughter, abandoned shoes, and the faint smell of cold dust. Teachers continued to prepare lessons, even as fewer students appeared. The routines persisted, but they were hollow, a shadow of the life that had once been. Outside the apartments, the mine loomed silently. Machinery stood rusting, tracks led to empty tunnels, and the entrances were guarded only by frost and ice. Once the heartbeat of the town, the mine now symbolized uncertainty. Even minor collapses or small explosions underground became ominous reminders of the fragility of life in Kadikit. Workers approached their tasks with care, aware that the rhythm that had sustained the town was failing. Community rituals persisted, but in diminished form. Occasional neighbors would gather in small groups for meals, or to share stories of friends who had left. Birthdays were quiet affairs, celebrated with improvised cakes or small gifts, each act tinged with the knowledge that life in Kadikit was no longer secure. The streets, though empty, sometimes carried the faint echoes of these gatherings. A laugh, a door opening, the scrape of a chair across frozen floors. Nature began to reclaim the town in subtle ways. Snow drifted into stairwells and lobbies. Icicles hung from roofs and gutters, glittering in the weak sunlight, but also weighing heavily on structures. Trees crept closer to buildings, their branches brushing against balconies where no one would stand. Birds nested in broken windows, their calls echoing through empty hallways. Even the frozen ground seemed to soften, as if Kadikit were slowly returning to the wilderness from which it had been carved. Over time, the remaining residents noticed the gradual deterioration of services. Electricity flickered or failed entirely. Heating became unreliable. Food supplies grew sparse. Water froze in pipes, forcing people to adapt creatively. Yet the town persisted. Residents endured, layering clothing, preparing meals over improvised stoves, shoveling snow, and maintaining what they could. Survival became an exercise in careful attention to detail, in anticipating failure and mitigating risk. Small personal stories emerged amid this quiet decay. A miner, once robust and confident, became wary, checking every beam and seam before beginning work. A mother waited by the window each morning for her children to return from school, even as attendance dwindled to just a handful of students. The pace of life slowed dramatically. Days blended into nights. Weeks turned into months. The seasonal rhythm remained, but only faintly. Snowfall, sunrise, sunset. Time stretched in silence. Those who stayed became attuned to small changes. The creak of buildings settling, frost patterns forming on windows, the lingering smell of coal in the air. Life continued, but cautiously. Residents maintained what routines they could. They cleared snow, lit fires, prepared meals, and shared quiet conversations. Everything felt fragile, held together by habit rather than certainty. Former residents later described scenes that captured this decline. Elderly locals were sometimes seen walking the empty streets, pausing outside apartment doors where families once lived, lingering as if remembering who had been there before. The town was still standing, but it no longer felt inhabited. The abandonment happened gradually. One apartment emptied, then another. Stairwells grew darker. Shops closed for longer periods. Furniture stayed where it was left. Calendars froze on forgotten dates. Small personal items, a child's toy, a coat, a pair of boots, remained behind as silent reminders of those who had moved on. By the end of this period, Kaditkin existed between life and memory. Buildings still stood, but they were hollow. Streets were intact, but empty. The mine, once the town's heartbeat, had become silent beneath the frozen ground. Snow, ice, and wind slowly reclaimed what had been built for survival. Kaditkin had been created for one purpose. When that purpose failed, everything connected to it began to fade. The town remained standing, but its future was already gone. Somewhere in the far northeast of Russia, Kaditkin still stands. Not as it once was, full of routine and noise, but as a quiet reminder of how quickly purpose can disappear. The apartment blocks remain. Windows are broken or frozen shut. Streets that once carried daily life now lie empty, snow drifting across them and erasing footprints almost as soon as they appear. Winter dominates everything here. The cold presses against buildings, doors creak in the wind, and frost coats street signs. Even small sounds, whine through a broken window, ice cracking in the distance, feel amplified by the silence. Inside the apartments, traces of life remain. Chairs stand where they were left. Books lie open. Toys sit unsorted. Calendars hang frozen on forgotten dates. The town was not destroyed. It was simply left behind. Nature has begun to reclaim it. Snow feast stairways. Trees grow through cracked concrete. Birds nest in broken windows. The mine, once the town's heartbeat, lies silent beneath the frozen ground, its machinery rusting, its tunnels empty. People still return sometimes, explorers, photographers, former residents. They walk the streets, pause outside old apartments, and move on. No one stays. There is no heat, no electricity, no life to return to. Kaditkin exists between memory and disappearance. The buildings are still standing, but the routines that gave them meaning are gone. It was a town built for one purpose. When that purpose failed, everything connected to it faded. What remains is silence, preserved by cold, waiting. Lake Baikal lies quietly in southeastern Siberia, close to the Mongolian border. On a map, it appears almost ordinary, and from the shore it looks peaceful and even inviting. In winter, it freezes into a vast sheet of ice, and in summer it mirrors the sky with near-perfect clarity. But Lake Baikal is not an ordinary lake. It is the deepest lake on Earth, reaching more than 1,600 meters at its lowest point. If Mount Everest were placed inside it, the peak would still remain submerged, and that depth defines everything about how the lake behaves. At the bottom, pressure is extreme and water temperatures remain near freezing throughout the year. Visibility can be misleading, and underwater currents exist where none should. Beneath the lake runs an active continental rift, meaning the ground itself is slowly pulling apart. Lake Baikal is not simply holding water, it sits on a geological wound. The lake contains nearly 20% of the planet's unfrozen freshwater, and its water is ancient, estimated to be more than 25 million years old. In winter, the ice becomes thick enough to support vehicles, and roads appear where water should be. People walk, fish, and camp on it, but Baikal does not freeze like other lakes. Temperature shifts, seismic movement, and internal pressure keep the ice under constant stress. In summer, the danger takes a different form. The water temperature rarely rises above 10 degrees Celsius, and cold shock can overwhelm a person within seconds, making breathing erratic and movement nearly impossible. Below the surface, light fades quickly, orientation becomes difficult, and even experienced divers report confusion. Compasses can behave unpredictably, and sound travels in unnatural ways. Despite this, the lake continues to be underestimated. Fishermen travel alone. Drivers take shortcuts across frozen sections. Tourists follow old tracks without knowing when they were last safe. And research equipment occasionally stops transmitting without clear explanation. When something does happen, it happens quickly. What makes Lake Baikal unsettling is not simply that people die there, because many environments are dangerous. What sets Baikal apart is how consistently indifferent it is. Survivors often describe the same experience, explaining that they followed rules, trusted conditions, and made no obvious mistakes, and then, without warning, the lake changed. Bodies are sometimes recovered days later, sometimes months later, and sometimes not at all. Vehicles sink vertically into depths beyond practical recovery, and search efforts are limited by weather, ice conditions, and the sheer scale of the lake. Some areas are approached with hesitation even by experienced teams. Official explanations usually exist, such as ice failure, hypothermia, disorientation, or equipment malfunction, and each explanation makes sense on its own. Yet Lake Baikal is rarely treated as a mystery. There are no warnings listing past incidents, no widespread restrictions, and no acknowledgement that certain areas behave unpredictably, and life around the lake continues as normal. From a distance, Baikal looks calm and understood, but up close it feels different. The silence feels heavier, the space feels wider, and the ice feels alive beneath your feet. People who spend time there often describe the same feeling afterward. Not fear and not the sense of being watched, but a quiet awareness of how small they felt. Lake Baikal does not need myths to be dangerous. Its depth, age, and geography are enough, and the danger was always there long before anyone disappeared. It was not hidden, it was ignored. Winter at Lake Baikal does not arrive slowly, and when it settles, it takes control. Temperatures drop far below freezing and remain there. Wind strips heat from exposed skin in seconds. Snow hardens into dense layers, and the surface of the lake begins to freeze. From the shore, it looks familiar as water stills and ice forms, gradually thickening enough to carry weight. Locals monitor it carefully, measuring thickness and marking safe paths, because for the communities around Baikal, winter ice is not scenery, but infrastructure. Once the ice is thick enough, roads appear and vehicles cross the lake instead of driving around it. Supplies move faster and entire villages depend on these routes, which may look reckless to outsiders but are routine to locals. However, Lake Baikal does not freeze like other lakes. Temperatures shift rapidly. Currents continue to move beneath the surface. Seismic activity from the rift below subtly shifts the lake bed, and pressure builds invisibly between ice and water. When that pressure releases, it does so without warning. Cracks can form instantly and stretch for kilometers, producing a sharp and unmistakable sound. In some cases, the ice opens just wide enough for a vehicle to fall through, while in others it opens beneath a person and closes again moments later. Even experienced drivers misjudge conditions, and cars have broken through ice that appeared solid minutes earlier, with some sinking almost vertically into depths where recovery was impossible. Survivors describe confusion followed by immediate immersion in freezing water, where cold shock is instant, breathing becomes uncontrolled, muscles lock, and swimming becomes impossible within seconds. Methane adds another risk, as gas escapes from sediment beneath the lake and becomes trapped under the ice in winter. From above, these areas look no different from solid ice, and when failure occurs, it is complete. Spring is especially dangerous because surface ice may look solid while lower layers weaken, creating conditions where nothing appears wrong above while the structure below is already failing. Weather changes quickly. Vehicles cannot approach unstable ice. Divers face extreme cold and poor visibility, and in many cases help arrives too late. This is why winter incidents at Baikal often end quickly, because the lake does not allow time. Certain areas are avoided without explanation. Certain sounds are taken seriously, and outsiders rarely hear the full stories. When the ice disappears, Lake Baikal does not become safer. It becomes less predictable. In summer, the surface reflects the sky and waves move slowly, making the lake appear manageable from a distance. Boats cross it daily, fishermen work close to shore, and tourists swim, dive, and kayak, but the cold remains. Breathing becomes shallow and erratic. Muscles stiffen, coordination fades, and panic becomes physical rather than mental as the body stops responding. Many victims are strong swimmers, but that rarely matters. Light fades faster than expected, depth perception collapses, and orientation becomes unreliable, with even experienced divers reporting sudden confusion in clear water. Large sections of shoreline drop sharply into darkness, where a single misstep can place someone beyond safe recovery depth almost instantly. Winds can shift suddenly, waves can build faster than expected, boats can capsize, and rescue distances become a problem long before help can arrive. Search efforts reach their limits quickly as depth restricts divers. Sonar loses clarity, weather interferes, and time works against recovery. Official explanations exist for nearly every incident, yet investigators are unsettled by how often the same sequence repeats under calm conditions during familiar activity, with no warning before sudden loss. Those who spend time on the lake often describe a shift in awareness, explaining that distance feels wrong, silence feels heavier, and the lake does not acknowledge human presence at all. By summer's end, when tourists leave and fishing slows, the lake returns to stillness, and nothing appears changed on the surface. No scars remain, and no visible reminders exist, leaving only absence above water, while beneath it the depth remains unchanged, patient, and unmoved. Lake Baikal waits quietly in Siberia, indifferent to the people who cross its ice or dive into its freezing depths. Far to the west, in the heart of Moscow, another kind of danger waits. Lubyanka Prison, where fear is deliberate and inevitable. Lubyanka Prison sits in the center of Moscow, facing one of the city's busiest squares. From the outside, the building does not look like a prison at all. It looks administrative, heavy, official, designed to blend into the machinery of the state. That was intentional. The structure was completed in the late 19th century as an insurance company headquarters. It was never meant to confine prisoners. When the Bolsheviks took power after the revolution, they repurposed the building without altering its character. Lubyanka did not need bars to intimidate. It needed permanence. By the early 1920s, the building became the headquarters of the Soviet secret police, first the Cheka, then the NKVD, and later the KGB. Over time, it developed a second function that was never openly acknowledged. People were brought inside. Many were never seen again. The prison component of Lubyanka was not marked on maps. There were no signs, no official acknowledgement. To the outside world, it remained an office building. To those taken through its doors, it became something else entirely. Arrests often happened quietly. Late at night, early in the morning, a knock on the door. Papers shone briefly. No raised voices. No explanations. Neighbors would see someone leave calmly, sometimes carrying a coat or documents, and assume it was routine business. Inside the building, the transition was immediate. Offices gave way to corridors that absorbed sound. Windows became rare. Time lost meaning. Prisoners later described the sensation of being removed from the city without ever leaving it. Lubyanka was not isolated on the outskirts of Moscow. It stood at the center of power. It reminded prisoners that what was happening to them was not chaos or excess. It was procedure. From the beginning, Lubyanka functioned less as a prison and more as a filter. People entered as individuals with names, professions, and histories. What left the building, if anything left at all, was paperwork. Charges were flexible. Evidence was secondary. Confessions were central. The building itself became part of the process, designed to confuse, exhaust, and isolate long before questioning even began. Those who passed through Lubyanka rarely described physical brutality first. They described silence, waiting, not knowing the time, not knowing the accusation, not knowing whether they would leave the building alive. And above all, they described the certainty that the building was not temporary. Once inside, Lubyanka did not feel like a place you passed through. It felt like a place that absorbed people. Lubyanka was not feared because it was secret. It was feared because everyone knew exactly what it was. And yet, from the street outside, nothing appeared unusual at all. This disorientation was deliberate and served as the first stage of control. Cells were small, sparsely furnished, and designed to prevent comfort rather than to restrain movement. Beds were often narrow or absent during the day, forcing prisoners to stand or sit for long periods. Lighting remained artificial at all hours, eliminating any connection to time outside. Windows, when present, were positioned too high or too small to provide meaningful reference. Silence was enforced inconsistently, which made it more effective. At times, complete quiet prevailed, broken only by distant footsteps or the closing of doors. At other times, noise was allowed to seep through walls in distorted fragments, voices, shuffling, or sudden mechanical sounds that could not be identified. Interrogation rooms were not physically dramatic. There were no instruments on display, no visible threats. The power of the room came from repetition and duration. Prisoners were often questioned for hours or days with minimal rest, moved between rooms at irregular intervals, and prevented from establishing any rhythm. Fatigue replaced resistance slowly and predictably. Interrogations followed no fixed schedule. Prisoners could be summoned at any hour, sometimes multiple times in a single day, sometimes not at all for long stretches. This uncertainty made waiting as exhausting as questioning. People described becoming afraid of the sound of approaching footsteps, not because of what might happen immediately, but because of what it represented. Food was minimal and inconsistent, sufficient to keep prisoners alive, but not comfortable. Sleep deprivation compounded this effect, as lights remained on and guards intervened whenever prisoners attempted to rest for too long. What made Lubyanka distinct was the emphasis on psychological pressure rather than overt violence. Prisoners were rarely told what they were accused of. When charges were mentioned, they were vague and changeable. Confessions were treated as administrative necessities rather than admissions of guilt, and the expectation was that one would eventually comply. The process was cumulative. Each day, without clarity, reduced the ability to resist. Each unanswered question eroded confidence in memory and judgment. Prisoners began to doubt their own recollections, their own intentions, and eventually their own identity. Records were kept meticulously, but access to them was absolute and one-sided. Prisoners did not know what was written about them, who had testified, or what decisions had already been made. Lubyanka did not operate as a place of punishment in the traditional sense. It operated as a place of transformation, where uncertainty replaced autonomy and compliance became the only stable option. By the time many prisoners left the interrogation rooms for the final time, the outcome no longer felt imposed. It felt inevitable. Lubyanka was not designed to function as a standalone prison, but as a central mechanism within a much larger system. Every interrogation, every file, and every confession fed into an administrative structure that extended far beyond the building itself. Decisions made inside its walls influenced arrests across the country, often weeks or months later. Interrogators were not improvising. They followed frameworks shaped by policy, quotas, and internal expectations. Confessions were not sought to uncover truth, but to complete a process. Once a narrative was established, it was adjusted until it aligned with institutional needs, regardless of accuracy. Prisoners were frequently confronted with documents they had never seen before, containing statements attributed to them or others. These records were presented as facts, even when they contradicted earlier claims. Challenging them was discouraged, not through threats, but through repetition and exhaustion, until resistance felt pointless. One of the most effective tools was isolation combined with selective information. Prisoners were sometimes told that others had already confessed, that their case was resolved, or that cooperation was the only remaining option. Whether these statements were true was irrelevant. Their purpose was to close perceived alternatives. Time inside Lubyanka was deliberately undefined. Prisoners did not know how long they had been held or how long they would remain. Days blurred together as routines shifted without explanation. This loss of temporal structure weakened the ability to plan, anticipate, or endure. Transfers in and out of the building reinforced its role as a processing center. Some prisoners arrived briefly before being sent onward to labor camps or execution sites. Others remained for extended periods without clarity about their fate. In both cases, Lubyanka functioned as the point where decisions became irreversible. The system relied on documentation more than spectacle. Files were updated continuously, stamped, signed, and passed between departments. Individuals were reduced to case numbers and summaries, making outcomes easier to manage administratively. Responsibility was distributed so widely that no single participant felt accountable for the result. This bureaucratic distance was intentional. It allowed the system to operate efficiently while minimizing personal hesitation. Interrogators focused on completion. Clerks focused on accuracy. Guards focused on procedure. Each role was narrow, and within that narrowness, harm became routine. Prisoners sensed this structure even if they could not see it. Many described the realization that they were not negotiating with a person, but interacting with a process. Appeals, explanations, and logic failed because they were irrelevant to the mechanism at work. Once a confession was signed, its contents mattered less than its existence. Retractions were ignored. Corrections were recorded, but dismissed. The document had fulfilled its function by confirming compliance, not truth. Lubyanka's power did not come from brutality alone, but from inevitability. The system moved forward regardless of individual actions, absorbing resistance without slowing. For those inside, the realization was gradual but unmistakable. The building did not decide guilt. It finalized it. What made Lubyanka especially enduring was that its influence did not end when a prisoner left the building. The paperwork generated inside it followed people long after release, shaping how they were treated, where they could live, and whether they could ever fully re-enter public life. A case resolved on paper was never truly closed. It remained active in archives, referenced quietly, revived when convenient. Former prisoners often discovered that freedom was conditional. Employment opportunities disappeared without explanation. Travel requests stalled indefinitely. Housing applications were delayed or denied. No reason was given, and none was required. The record existed, and its presence was enough. This administrative shadow was often more damaging than imprisonment itself. It created a permanent uncertainty that could not be challenged directly. There was no authority to appeal to, no document to refute, no clear accusation to address. The absence of clarity made correction impossible. Families absorbed this pressure as well. Relatives learned quickly which questions not to ask and which names not to mention. Conversations narrowed. Social circles contracted. People adjusted not because they were instructed to, but because experience taught them the boundaries. Lubyanka's records became a form of social memory, one that outlived the individuals who created it. Clerks changed. Administrators retired. Political language shifted. The files remained. They were reorganized, relabeled, sometimes partially erased, but never fully removed from relevance. In later years, when archives were selectively opened, historians encountered this legacy firsthand. Files contradicted one another. Confessions conflicted with timelines. Charges were vague or internally inconsistent. Yet the outcomes were definitive. Sentences had been carried out. Lies had been redirected or erased. The paperwork had done its work regardless of its accuracy. This revealed a deeper truth about the system. Lubyanka did not operate on certainty. It operated on momentum. Once a case began moving, stopping it required intervention from outside the structure, and such intervention was rare. Inertia favored continuation. This also explains why fear associated with the building persisted even during periods of political thaw. The architecture of control remained intact. Practices were softened, language was adjusted, but the underlying mechanism was unchanged. People understood that the system could reactivate quickly because it never truly shut down. Those who worked inside the building experienced this continuity differently. Many described their roles as technical rather than moral. They processed information, followed instructions, met targets. Distance from outcomes was reinforced institutionally. Reflection was unnecessary and often discouraged. Over time, this normalization blurred boundaries between legality and legitimacy. Actions were considered acceptable not because they were just, but because they were standard. Repetition replaced evaluation. Procedure replaced judgment. This environment produced a specific kind of authority. Not charismatic, not ideological, administrative. Power expressed through forms, schedules, and approvals rather than speeches or force. It was quiet, persistent, and difficult to confront directly. Lubyanka symbolized this authority precisely because it was unremarkable in operation. There were no grand rituals, no dramatic declarations, just a steady flow of people entering, being processed, and exiting into different futures. The absence of spectacle made resistance harder to sustain. Without clear moments of outrage, opposition fragmented. People adapted individually rather than collectively. Survival became personal rather than political. Even after the most intense periods passed, the building retained its gravity. Employees spoke of it carefully. Visitors noticed the atmosphere immediately. It was not fear in the theatrical sense, but a weight created by accumulated outcomes, by decisions made repeatedly without reversal. Lubyanka did not rely on secrecy alone. Its power came from familiarity. Everyone knew what it was for. Everyone understood what entry implied. That shared understanding reduced the need for explanation or enforcement. By the time someone reached its doors, the process had already begun elsewhere. Surveillance, suspicion, documentation, and categorization preceded physical detention. The building simply concentrated these forces into one location, where resolution became unavoidable. This is why Lubyanka remains difficult to separate from the system that created it. It was not an aberration. It was a logical endpoint, a place where abstract control became tangible, where policy became personal, and where the state interacted with individuals not as citizens, but as cases. And for most who passed through it, the most unsettling realization was not what happened inside, but how smoothly it fit into everything else. Lubyanka still matters because it represents a system that does not require violence to function, only continuity. The building stands as a reminder that control can be maintained through routine, documentation, and quiet compliance rather than spectacle. Its history shows how institutions outlive the ideologies that create them. Even after political shifts and public reassessments, the structure of authority that Lubyanka embodied did not vanish. Procedures changed, language softened, and visibility decreased, but the core logic remained recognizable. Systems built on classification and administrative distance adapt easily because they depend on process rather than belief. Physical spaces carry memory in ways laws and speeches do not. Lubyanka's presence in the center of Moscow is not symbolic by accident. It reflects how power prefers proximity to normal life rather than separation from it. The building does not dominate the skyline, yet it is impossible to ignore once its history is known. What makes Lubyanka unsettling is not what it was, but how ordinary its operation became. It demonstrates how harm can be organized efficiently when responsibility is divided and outcomes are abstracted. No single action appears extreme, yet the cumulative effect is irreversible. Around the early 1950s, just outside Moscow, Soviet film planners approved what looked like a simple infrastructure decision. They needed space. Not a soundstage, not a back room, real space. Streets that could be damaged, rebuilt, redressed, and filmed repeatedly without shutting down actual Moscow neighborhoods or drawing public attention. Filming in live cities was expensive, unpredictable, and politically inconvenient. So instead of borrowing reality, they decided to recreate it. The Gorky Film Studio backlit was designed to function like a city while never officially being one. The plan was to construct environments realistic enough that directors could move actors through them naturally, without having to cheat angles or explain layouts to the camera. These were not facades meant to hold up for a single shot. They were not temporary props designed to be torn down after filming wrapped. Entire neighborhoods were built from the ground up. Apartment blocks included stairwells that connected floors logically. Schools contained full corridors and classrooms. Industrial yards were fitted with fixed machinery bolted into place, not for function, but for weight, scale, and authenticity. Roads curved the way real roads do, guided by practical movement rather than visual drama. It was realism by design, and for years, that control held. But over time, as productions ended and new ones replaced them, that realism stopped being managed and started existing on its own. By the late 1960s, the backlit had already outgrown its original purpose. What had started as a controlled filming environment was no longer being cleared between productions. Dismantling sets required labor, materials, and approvals, and those resources were increasingly directed elsewhere. If a structure could be reused, it was altered. If it could not, it was left exactly where it stood. This decision was never announced. It emerged quietly, through habit rather than policy. Crews stopped thinking in terms of removal and began thinking in terms of adaptation. Walls were reinforced instead of torn down. Interiors were repainted rather than rebuilt. A building constructed to represent civilian housing might later be used as an administrative office, then repurposed again as an industrial interior, without its external form ever changing. Over time, this created a layered environment with no clear timeline. New constructions were placed beside older ones without regard for continuity. Roads connected areas that had never been intended to coexist. Utility lines were extended to buildings whose original function had already been forgotten. The backlit expanded not according to a master plan, but according to immediate production needs. By the 1970s, even long-term studio employees could no longer identify which structures belonged to which films. Call sheets referenced building numbers rather than names. Location lists circulated without descriptions. Crews arrived on set knowing only where to stand, not what the place had been designed to represent. Some buildings showed clear signs of ongoing use. Others were sealed, locked, or simply ignored. There were structures that had not appeared in a film for years, yet remained wired for electricity and connected to studio infrastructure, maintained just enough to avoid collapse. What made this unusual was not abandonment, but uncertainty. No one was officially responsible for deciding when a set stopped being a set. There was no final inspection, no decommissioning process, no point at which a structure was formally declared obsolete. It simply slipped out of active use and stayed behind. As a result, the backlit stopped resetting itself. Instead of cycling through creation and removal, it accumulated. Each production added mass, complexity, and confusion. Over decades, this transformed the area into something that no longer behaved like a studio, but also could not be classified as anything else. It was no longer clear where filmmaking ended and where infrastructure began, and that ambiguity would shape everything that followed. By the early 1980s, the problem was no longer scale but control. The backlit now covered an area large enough that it could not be monitored consistently. Officially, it remained a restricted production zone, but in practice, enforcement depended entirely on which department was responsible at the time. Some periods were tightly managed, with passes checked and movement limited. Other periods passed with no visible oversight at all. This inconsistency created gaps. Crews began encountering buildings that were not listed in current production documents. Locations appeared on schedules with only numeric identifiers, offering no indication of what the structure had originally been built to represent or when it had last been used. Electrical systems functioned in places that had not hosted filming in years. Some sections were clearly maintained. Others showed no signs of attention, yet remained accessible. Doors were unlocked. Stairwells were intact. Utilities worked without explanation. There was no visible boundary separating active areas from inactive ones. Former employees later described wandering into structures they had never seen before despite years on site. These were not hidden spaces or underground rooms, but full buildings integrated into the layout, connected by roads and walkways that suggested deliberate planning. Records did exist, but they were fragmented. Architectural plans were stored separately from production logs. Renovation work was often undocumented if it was done for short-term use. As departments changed and staff rotated, institutional memory faded faster than the structures themselves. What emerged was a space governed less by rules than by momentum. If a building stood, it was assumed to be usable. If it was connected to power, it was considered active, regardless of whether anyone remembered activating it. The absence of a clear prohibition became permission by default. This was not secrecy, it was procedural erosion. And as oversight weakened, the backlit began functioning in ways that no longer aligned with its original purpose. Not because anyone chose to change it, but because no one was left making decisions about what it should become. As oversight weakened, the backlit began to develop a presence that was difficult to explain to anyone who had not walked through it themselves. The discomfort did not come from decay alone. Many real cities decay, far more dramatically. What unsettled visitors was coherence without activity. Streets aligned properly. Buildings faced one another the way they would in functioning districts. Sightlines made sense. Movement through the space felt intuitive, as if it had been shaped by daily use rather than design. But there was no evidence of that use. Inside the buildings, interiors followed practical logic. Stairwells were placed where they would be in residential blocks. Corridors connected rooms in efficient sequences. Doorways were sized for regular traffic, not camera framing. In some areas, fixtures remained installed long after their last appearance on film. Not because they were staged, but because removing them served no immediate purpose. The absence of signage made orientation harder, not easier. There were no markers explaining what a building was meant to be. No labels distinguishing sets from infrastructure. Without those cues, the environment resisted interpretation. It neither confirmed nor denied its own artificiality. Employees who entered inactive sections reported a consistent sensation of misplacement. The space behaved like a functioning environment, but offered no social signals. No sound of occupation. No patterns of wear that suggested routine movement. Everything appeared paused rather than abandoned. Because the backlit had been assembled over decades, there was no single architectural style to read. Concrete structures from one era stood beside prefabricated forms from another. Renovations overlapped without alignment. The result was an environment that felt assembled rather than planned. Your attention was drawn not to any single structure, but to the absence of narrative. In real neighborhoods, buildings suggest purpose through context. Here, context was missing. The setting looked complete, yet refused to explain itself. The longer sections remained and used, the more pronounced this effect became. The backlit was no longer simply a place where filming did not occur. It had become a place that did not provide enough information to be understood at all. By the time the Soviet Union entered its final decade, the Gorky Film Studio backlit no longer fit cleanly into any category that existed on paper. It still appeared in studio records and remained structurally intact, but in reality, it had slipped into a space where no single department fully controlled it and no long-term plan defined its purpose. This was not secrecy or neglect by design. It was the result of systems changing faster than physical environments could adapt. As large-scale outdoor filming became less central to production, the backlit lost urgency without ever being formally closed. Maintenance continued unevenly. Areas still used received attention, while others were simply left standing, functional but unnecessary. The absence of a clear endpoint mattered more than abandonment. Buildings were not demolished or repurposed. They remained ready but unused, creating a place that felt prepared for activity that never came. What exists now is not a ruin and not a working studio, but something in between. A constructed environment that outlived its reason for being there, continuing to stand because no one ever decided what should replace it or whether it should end at all. If you had walked onto the backlit of the Gorky Film Studio in the late 1950s, you would have seen a flawless future. Vast sets of modern Soviet cities and heroic workers filled the frame, all designed to manufacture a dream of stability and progress. This was the heart of the Soviet propaganda machine, built to convince the world that the system was perfect. But while the cameras rolled in Moscow, a reality was unfolding 900 miles away that would never be allowed on screen. On September 29, 1957, at a secret nuclear facility near VIII, a waste tank's cooling system failed. Internal temperatures soared until the tank detonated with a force of 70 tons of TNT. There was no mushroom cloud or siren. Instead, a silent, radioactive plume drifted across the countryside, settling over villages, rivers, and forests. This invisible poison formed the East Ural radioactive trace, a disaster that, at the time, had no name and no acknowledgement. The Soviet government classified the incident instantly. Newspapers remained silent, and doctors were ordered to treat unfamiliar illnesses without using the word radiation. Families in the fallout zone were left in place, harvesting contaminated crops and drinking from toxic rivers, unaware that every meal was a death sentence. As residents in the Urals were poisoned by a landscape that looked perfectly normal, the Gorky Film Studio continued to export images of safety and technological mastery. These were parallel realities, one carefully constructed to be seen, the other deliberately erased. On screen, the atom was a symbol of progress. Off-screen, it was a silent killer that the system was willing to ignore to protect its image. In the weeks following the explosion near VIII, the absence of information became the most dangerous element of the disaster. Because nothing had officially occurred, nothing officially required explanation. Life in the affected regions continued as normal, even as subtle evidence accumulated that something fundamental had changed. Doctors began noticing patterns they could not explain. Patients arrived with burns that had no source, skin damage unlike chemical exposure, and exhaustion that progressed unnaturally fast. Hair loss appeared in clusters. Children weakened without infection. Pregnancies failed or resulted in complications no one had been trained to classify. Each symptom was treated in isolation and recorded under vague categories that avoided identifying a cause. Instructions were indirect. Medical staff were told what not to say rather than what was happening. Reports moved upward into sealed channels and never returned. while those submitting them continued working without protection or explanation. Without an acknowledged cause, responsibility could not be assigned or challenged. Villages beneath the contamination path were not evacuated immediately. Some residents were removed months later with little warning and no explanation, then erased as homes were demolished, wells sealed, and village names removed from maps. Other communities remained occupied for years as radiation settled into soil, wood, and water, embedding itself into daily life. The Teka River became a persistent source of exposure. Radioactive material accumulated in its sediment and continued moving downstream long after airborne fallout settled. Fish absorbed it, livestock drank from it, families depended on it, unaware the river itself had become a delivery system for radiation. What made the damage irreversible was duration. People were not briefly exposed and removed. They remained inside it. The environment showed no visible warning. Crops grew, forests stayed green, houses stood intact, with no signal to flee. Radiation accumulated invisibly at the cellular level. At the same time, the Gorky Film Studio in Moscow continued operating without interruption. Films emphasized control, order, and technological mastery, reinforcing the illusion that failure was impossible. Information moved in one direction. What happened near KYSHDYM never reached the screen, while what appeared on screen made KYSHDYM unthinkable. Filmmakers did not know what doctors were seeing. Doctors were not told why it was happening. Officials issuing orders were never required to explain them. By the early 1960s, internal studies confirmed increased cancer rates, genetic damage, and shortened lifespans. These findings were classified and archived, never meant to inform those living with the consequences. Containment followed quietly. Forests were restricted. A reserve was created. Access was limited without explanation. Warning signs appeared only where radiation could no longer be ignored. Without acknowledgement, the disaster persisted. The damage lived in bodies and landscapes rather than records. What remained was a split reality, one constructed to be seen, the other lived and concealed. And as long as that division held, the consequences did not need resolution. They only needed containment. By the late 1960s, the consequences of KYSHDYM had stopped being confined to individual bodies and had begun reshaping the landscape itself. What could not be erased medically was managed spatially. The solution was not disclosure, but distance. Entire zones were reclassified without explanation. Access roads were blocked. Forests were placed under restriction. Maps were quietly updated to remove villages that no longer officially existed. To the outside world, these changes appeared administrative, the kind of adjustments that happened routinely in a centrally managed state. To those living nearby, they marked the slow disappearance of familiar places without reason or closure. One of the most heavily contaminated areas was converted into what the state described as a protected nature reserve. Officially, it was an environmental preservation zone. In reality, it was a containment measure. By reframing exclusion as conservation, the government avoided admitting that the land itself had become dangerous. Wildlife studies were permitted. Human access was not. This shift allowed the problem to be sealed geographically while remaining unresolved politically. Radiation does not respect borders, and neither did its consequences. People who had already been exposed carried damage with them when they were relocated. Illness followed families into new towns. Patterns repeated across generations. Birth defects, cancers, and immune disorders appeared in populations that no longer lived anywhere near the original contamination path, severing the visible link between cause and effect. Medical recognition lagged behind lived reality. Conditions were treated but rarely explained. Compensation, when it existed at all, was fragmented and inconsistent. Many affected residents were never officially classified as victims because classification required documentation that had never been created or had been deliberately withheld. The disaster became statistical rather than historical, a matter of elevated rates instead of named events. At the same time, the state narrative remained intact. Technological progress continued to be celebrated publicly. Nuclear power was framed as safe, controlled, and essential. Failures were presented as hypothetical risks that had been eliminated through discipline and expertise. The existence of KYSHDYM contradicted this image, which is why it remained excluded rather than addressed. This exclusion created a peculiar imbalance. The further the event receded into the past, the more permanent its effects became. Land could not be cleansed. Genetic damage could not be reversed. Rivers continued carrying sediment long after the original source was contained. What had begun as a single explosion evolved into a condition that extended indefinitely forward in time. When partial disclosures finally emerged decades later, they arrived stripped of urgency. The information confirmed what local populations already knew, but did little to change their circumstances. Acknowledgement did not undo exposure. Naming the disaster did not remove it from the soil. What KYSHDYM demonstrated was not just the danger of radiation, but the durability of systems designed to absorb failure without admitting it. By controlling information, the state delayed accountability. By controlling space, it delayed confrontation. By controlling narrative, it delayed memory. And in that delay, the disaster never truly ended. By the 1970s, the KYSHDYM zone had become a place both present and absent. Maps showed boundaries. Forests grew over former villages. Roads led to places that no longer existed. The land looked normal, but the air, water, and soil carried a memory that could not be seen. Exposure persisted quietly, invisibly, in people, animals, and the environment. Local residents who remained or returned lived inside that memory every day. Every well, every field, every path carried risk. Life adapted, but adaptation was not safety. Children played in streets still warm with summer sun, unaware of the invisible particles embedded in dust and dirt. Families harvested crops, drank from rivers, tended livestock, all while invisible decay continued. Outside observers saw nothing. The land appeared safe. There were no ruins, no mushroom clouds, no immediate spectacle to demand attention. And that absence became part of the disaster itself. Danger that could not be seen was easier to ignore. The threat remained constant, unacknowledged, and cumulative. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Gorky Film Studio backlit continued projecting perfection. Streets aligned, buildings gleamed, and workers moved with purpose. The illusion was absolute. The Soviet dream thrived on film, even as its people were silently poisoned in reality. The two worlds, one constructed, one lived, existed side by side, never intersecting. One demanded attention, the other demanded ignorance. Researchers who studied the area decades later described it as an environment out of balance. Nature had reclaimed space in some areas, but human artifacts persisted in others. Contamination moved through sediment, water, and soil. Wildlife carried radiation. People who had once been relocated carried damage into new communities. The disaster was mobile, persistent, and invisible. KYSHDYM was not a moment. It was a process. It was slow, silent, and relentless. And because no one admitted what had happened, the danger became structural, embedded in daily life, in decisions not taken, in knowledge that was deliberately withheld. By the late 1980s, when the truth began leaking, the revelation was not shocking because it was sudden. It was shocking because it was cumulative. The land had already absorbed decades of exposure. Bodies had already borne the consequences. Families had already been reshaped. A disaster defined by delay was still defining the people it touched. By the time the KYSHDYM disaster was acknowledged decades later, the damage was already permanent. This wasn't a story for history books, because history demands resolution. KYSHDYM offered none. It was a disaster of silence, delay, and deliberate erasure. The land itself became deceptive. Forests grew over abandoned villages, but the growth was a lie. Soil was saturated with strontium, 90, and cesium, 137. Grass looked healthy, but radiation lingered, woven into the living tissue of the environment. Crops absorbed isotopes. Livestock grazed on invisible hazards. The Teka River, once a source of life, became a conveyor of contamination, carrying radioactive sediment into homes for decades. People were altered at a cellular level. Doctors diagnosed unfamiliar illnesses while being forbidden from saying radiation. They treated burns without fire, hair loss without cause, and filed every case into restricted archives. Administrative decisions were made to obscure responsibility. Village names disappeared from maps. Restricted zones were labeled nature preserves. Visibility was removed. Accountability was impossible. While this unfolded, the Gorky Film Studio in Moscow operated as if reality could be controlled by artifice. Cameras captured clean streets, disciplined citizens, and a future of technological triumph. Hundreds of miles away, the real world was fractured, toxic, and unmanageable. One world was framed for the camera. The other could only be endured. KYSHDYM was never spectacular collapse. It was methodical, invisible, and inescapable, written into the DNA of generations. When the truth finally surfaced in the late 1980s, it wasn't revelation, it was confirmation. The Soviet state proved one thing. You can edit a film, but you cannot recall the soil. In the late 1940s, the Soviet Union needed a place to test nuclear weapons, somewhere remote, controllable, and easy to hide. What they chose was a vast stretch of land in northeastern Kazakhstan, near the city of Semipalatinsk. On paper, it was described as uninhabited steppe. In reality, more than 1 million people lived within range. Villages dotted the plains. Families raised livestock. Children walked to school. Rivers ran through farmland. None of this stopped the site from being approved. The area was renamed Polygon, a technical term that made it sound empty, experimental, manageable. On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb there. The explosion was massive. A blinding flash, a rising fireball, a shock wave that shattered windows miles away. But there were no evacuations, no public warnings, no explanation. Residents were told a military exercise was taking place. Some were instructed to stand outside and watch. Fallout drifted silently over villages. Radioactive particles settled onto roofs, fields, clothing, and skin. People returned to daily life within hours, unaware that the dust clinging to them would remain inside their bodies for decades. This wasn't an accident. The tests were designed to measure blast effects on structures, equipment, and exposure on living populations. Houses were built, animals were tethered, and instruments were placed inside homes where people still lived. Between 1949 and 1963, over 100 nuclear weapons were detonated above ground at Semipalatinsk. Each explosion sent radiation directly into the air, then into nearby communities. There were no sirens, no emergency broadcasts, no official danger. The land looked normal. The sky cleared. Life continued, and that normalcy became the most dangerous part. After the first detonations at Semipalatinsk, the Soviet authorities did not treat exposure as an emergency, but as a variable. Instead of removing populations from danger, they adjusted observation protocols, turning entire communities into long-term data sources while preserving the appearance of normal civilian life. Radiation levels were measured carefully, but the results were classified, and the people generating those readings were never informed of what they meant for their health. Medical teams were dispatched to the region, not to warn or protect residents, but to document outcomes. Doctors recorded symptoms without context, cataloging patterns that emerged over time while avoiding any language that acknowledged radiation as the cause. Skin lesions, chronic fatigue, gastrointestinal damage, neurological decline, and reproductive complications were logged as unrelated conditions, each treated in isolation despite their obvious clustering around test schedules. Villagers were repeatedly exposed during different stages of testing, often without realizing a detonation had occurred. Explosions took place miles away, but fallout traveled far beyond the visible blast zone, carried by wind and weather into homes, wells, and fields. People continued farming contaminated soil, consuming produce and dairy that absorbed radioactive isotopes, and passing exposure forward through food chains that never broke. Children became one of the clearest indicators of long-term harm, although the significance of their conditions was deliberately downplayed. Developmental delays, immune disorders, and increased cancer rates appeared at levels far beyond national averages, yet were attributed to nutrition, climate, or genetics rather than environmental exposure. Pregnancies were closely observed, not to prevent harm, but to record outcomes that would later inform internal assessments of survivability. Despite mounting internal evidence, testing continued. Nuclear detonations were treated as routine operations, scheduled and executed with precision, while civilian life was expected to adapt around them. Residents were sometimes instructed to shelter indoors during tests, sometimes told nothing at all, and occasionally brought closer to observe blast effects under controlled conditions without understanding the risks involved. What made Semipalatinsk especially destructive was not a single explosion, but repetition. Exposure was cumulative, layered year after year into bodies that never had time to recover. Radiation embedded itself into bone, tissue, and genetic material, ensuring that damage would not remain confined to one generation, but would extend forward in unpredictable ways. By the time atmospheric testing slowed in the early 1960s, the region had already been fundamentally altered. The experiment had succeeded in one sense. It produced data. What it did not produce was accountability. The people who lived through it remained where they were, carrying invisible consequences, while the state preserved the narrative that everything remained under control. When atmospheric testing at Semipalatinsk slowed and eventually paused, the danger did not recede with it. The explosions ended, but the environment they had created remained active, saturated with radioactive material that had settled into soil, water, and infrastructure. What had once been test fallout became background reality, an invisible condition that reshaped daily life without announcing itself. The land continued to function as if nothing had happened. Fields were planted, animals grazed, wells were used for drinking and cooking. The absence of visible destruction reinforced the belief that the worst was over, even as radioactive isotopes persisted in the ecosystem, cycling through crops, livestock, and human bodies. Exposure became continuous rather than episodic, sustained through ordinary routines rather than extraordinary events. Health consequences intensified rather than diminished. Cancers appeared years after the last visible flash in the sky. Bone marrow disorders, thyroid damage, and immune system failures became increasingly common, particularly among those exposed as children. Genetic damage manifested slowly, surfacing in birth defects and developmental abnormalities that could not be traced to a single moment, but pointed unmistakably to long-term exposure. Medical response remained constrained by policy rather than necessity. Clinics treated symptoms without naming causes, and physicians who recognized radiation-related patterns were limited in how they could document or discuss them. Official diagnoses avoided environmental attribution, ensuring that illness could be managed administratively rather than politically. Without recognition, there could be no public reckoning. Relocation efforts, when they occurred at all, were selective and incomplete. Some villages were moved decades after the heaviest exposure, long after the damage had already been done. Others remained in place indefinitely, deemed acceptable losses within acceptable limits that were never publicly defined. Those who relocated carried their exposure with them, severing the geographic link between cause and consequence and allowing the broader system to deny responsibility. The test site itself was gradually reclassified and restricted, presented as a controlled military zone rather than a contaminated landscape. Warning signs appeared inconsistently, offering prohibitions without explanation. Researchers continued to study the area under classified programs, measuring persistence rather than prevention, While surrounding populations lived alongside the remains of an experiment they had never agreed to participate in. What emerged was a disaster without a clear endpoint. There was no moment when safety was restored, no declaration that danger had passed. The testing program ended on paper, but its effects continued unfolding across decades, embedded in bodies and ecosystems that could not reset. Semipalatinsk did not collapse in a single catastrophic event. It transitioned quietly from a test site into a condition, one that outlasted the explosions themselves and ensured that even in silence, the experiment was still ongoing. By the time internal authorities fully understood the scale of damage around Semipalatinsk, the question was no longer whether people had been harmed, but how much of that harm could be acknowledged without destabilizing the system that caused it. Knowledge existed, but it was compartmentalized, reduced to classified reports and restricted studies that measured consequences without permitting responsibility. Soviet scientists documented radiation levels far beyond what had been publicly admitted. They tracked elevated cancer clusters, shortened life expectancy, and generational health decline in communities downwind of the test site. These findings circulated within closed scientific and military circles, where they informed future testing protocols but never reached the populations already affected. The purpose of research shifted from protection to optimization, refining how much exposure could be absorbed without triggering visible crisis. Public disclosure was treated as a strategic risk. Admitting widespread harm would have undermined the narrative of technological control and national security. Instead, silence became policy. Villagers were not told what had happened to them or why illness followed family lines. Compensation systems, where they existed, required documentation that exposure had never officially occurred, creating a loop that excluded most victims by design. Children carried the heaviest burden. Many were born years after the largest tests, yet exhibited congenital abnormalities, neurological impairments, and immune deficiencies linked to parental exposure. These outcomes were labeled tragic but unexplained, severing them from their origin. Without acknowledged cause, there was no prevention, only repetition. Arrived too late to alter outcomes. The land remained contaminated. The health effects remained irreversible. Recognition did not translate into restoration. International studies eventually confirmed what local populations had lived with for decades. Semipalatinsk was among the most irradiated inhabited regions on Earth. Yet even then, remediation lagged behind acknowledgement. Cleanup was selective. Funding was inconsistent. Entire communities continued living atop residual contamination because relocation was deemed impractical. What defined Semipalatinsk was not just the damage inflicted, but the structure that allowed it to persist. A system capable of measuring harm while refusing to confront it had proven durable. Silence extended the lifespan of the disaster far beyond the final test. And by the time the world learned what had happened, the experiment was no longer in the ground alone. It was in people, in families, in generations that would carry its effects forward without ever having been given a choice. When the last nuclear test at Semipalatinsk finally ended, the testing did not. The explosion stopped, but the environment continued the experiment on its own. Soil retained radioactive isotopes. Water carried contamination through daily use. Wind redistributed particles across land that still looked ordinary. Life resumed on terrain that had already been altered beyond recovery. For the people who lived there, exposure was not an event. It was a condition. Radiation did not announce itself. And without visible damage, there was nothing to flee from. Families stayed because they were never told they were in danger. And when they were told, it was long after the damage had already taken root. Semipalatinsk was not abandoned because it was unusable. It remained inhabited because admitting its danger would have meant admitting responsibility. The cost of relocation, compensation, and acknowledgement was considered greater than the cost of silence. What remains today is land that still measures abnormal, communities that still report elevated illness, and a history that was almost erased by classification and delay. The site is no longer secret. but its consequences are still unfolding. Semipalatins proves something uncomfortable. Disasters do not need to be sudden to be devastating. They only need to be hidden long enough to become permanent. If stories like this matter to you, if you're drawn to the places history tried to bury instead of explain, then this is what we do here. Subscribe to Mr. Vile. Discover real dark and mysterious cases.